Okay, well, let's start by asking what imperialism is. And I would argue that imperialism is the political form of the domination which flows from combined and uneven development of global capitalism. And that's a big mouthful. What it means is that capitalism has never developed equally across the world. And we still live in a world where clearly the economic development of certain areas are far in advance of others. Now I'm going to use some terms here like advanced and backward, which do not apply to the state of civilization in the countries I'm talking about. I'm going to use them in terms of simply capitalist development, which is another thing. I mean, for instance, when India was actually began to be colonised by the British, it was actually far more superior to Britain and was widely recognised at the time. Just Britain was militarily and capitalistically more sort of aggressive in terms of colonising. So forgive me, don't take offence to this. So in the world we live in, there is complete unevenness at the way in which different countries develop. And we still live in a world, I would argue that despite much talk of the BRICS and the way the countries are developing, imperialism is still centred very much on North America, Europe, Japan, and a few other countries tagged along. Maybe we can come back and discuss some of that in discussion. And a hierarchy of nation states exists in which the premier division exert their domination through economic, political, and financial and military means. It also involves other things in today's world which might be worth talking about. It means, for instance, control of natural resources, not just simply oil, but other natural resources around the world, like food, for instance. It involves control of trade routes, which is why, for instance, the Persian Gulf figures very high as one of the trouble spots in the world because the outflow for oil from the major Middle East oil fields. It involves patents, which we've seen used by multinational corporations in the developing world to drive up costs for the drugs to deal with HIV and things like that. And it involves cultural hegemony by essentially a very small number of media outlets inside the world, including some of the new social media, it should be said as well, incidentally, which you should be aware of when we're discussing those phenomena. So imperialism operates at very different levels. And the political forms it's taken have changed since the beginning of the last century, when a number of writers wrote about imperialism in quite groundbreaking ways. The British liberal J. Hobson, then in the Marxist tradition, Lenin, Bukharin, and Luxemburg. We no longer live in a world where British colonial officials in pith helmets administer to the natives. There are very few places which are under direct colonial rule now. That was the primary form that imperialism took at the beginning of the 20th century. But it doesn't really exist as that anymore. It should be added that America had already began creating its own imperialism, largely eschewing, even then, direct colonialism. It did have colonies in the Philippines at the time, Puerto Rico, but it decided to operate a different model which did not involve direct colonialism. But the substance remains the same in terms of the effect of domination by an elite group of nation states, very much tied to multinational capitals and again corporations. And again, for a time to talk about British imperialism, it's worth looking at in terms of the major corporations in the world, where they are situated in terms of their headquarters, because it tells a story. They are still largely based in North America and Europe, and still largely based in those political entities. Things are changing, we shouldn't be oblivious to that, but it is still very much tied to that, and it's very difficult to separate out big corporations like BAA in Britain or Boeing in America from the British and American state. They're very much intertwined, an exchange of personnel, people moving from senior government positions which allocate contracts or jobs in the Ministry of Defence into the boardroom. The very, very close integration of that. And while the substance has changed, and certain things I would also argue has changed. One of the things that's changed in the last century and a bit is that we now have a situation where we have, yes, the Premier League of imperialist powers, but underneath that we have, if you like, sub-imperialist powers, which don't look towards global domination, but do look towards exerting at least regional control over parts of the globe. Take, for instance, Saudi Arabia, which with the collapse of Mubarak in Egypt is now desperate to play a role in exerting control over the Arabian Peninsula and is egging on anyone to attack Iran, essentially, in order to combat Iranian hegemony. Saudi Arabia is desperate to be a sub-imperialism in that region. Nigeria plays a role similar. South Africa has ambitions in this. There are a number of countries, but all do so essentially in league with one or more of the advanced imperialist countries. And sometimes problems can emerge when they don't understand actually what the imperialist states are telling them. I mean, way long time ago in 1990, someone who'd been one of America's allies didn't understand that he'd been told not to invade Kuwait. But Saddam Hussein, who'd been America's ally against Iran, went ahead and did it, and then probably paid a very big price for it, you know, and ended Iraq's influence in terms of playing that role, which America had egged it on again. So I haven't got time to talk about British imperialism, but if we want to discuss it in because again, I think it's quite interesting to look at how Britain still plays a very key role as an imperialist power, and still, because of its imperialist legacy, has industrial, which is often overlooked, and always are guilty about when we go on about Britain, and sort of, you know, sort of saying, oh, Britain doesn't produce anything anymore. You know, if you look at the top 100 corporations in the world, Britain's up there. In finance, it's equal with the Americans. You know, Britain is a serious player. It's the 5th military player in the world in terms of that. In Europe, very importantly, it's only one of 2 states which has got serious military capability, the other being France, which is in part an explanation for the Libyan war, if you want to look into it. Britain and France exerting their military power inside the European Union to sort of tell Germany, well, you've got to pay attention to us. You can't just ride roughshod over us. Okay, economically, we're not up with you, but we've got to do it. But to return to a discussion of Marxism and imperialism, the strength of those like Lenin and those who came to form the Communist International after the Russian Revolution in 1917 was that they stressed the necessity of anti-imperialism. And that represented a break with what had been until then the dominant position on the left inside the previous international, the Second International, the one that the majority had supported the First World War and Lenin had broken from. Right? The centre of the Second International, the majority of it, essentially regarded colonialism as an okay thing. It had, you know, too many bad features, it's a bit brutal here and there, and the Belgians were particularly nasty, but you know, essentially it was a good thing. It's a sort of mechanical interpretation of Marxism. Colonialism by Britain, France, etc. would bring industrial capitalism to these countries. You had industrial capitalism, you got a working class, and eventually you could talk about socialism in them. So a really mechanical interpretation of Marxism there. And to be honest, there was also a right wing who were virtually openly racist in support for their nation state, and in the idea that really these people were, you know, they needed the West to come and tell them what to do, and I'm not kidding it in that. The centre of that was already that Lenin understood that you had to be an anti-imperialist, absolutely. And the key writing in that came with the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin in Ireland, when the left took a very confused position on it. Lenin was absolutely clear that you had to support the Easter Rising despite the leadership of that rising. Now, there were some good people in that rising, like James Connolly. There were also some blithering idiots in it who talked about the need for blood sacrifices. If you read the proclamation of the rising, it's fairly bizarre, in the name of God and all sorts of things. It wasn't a socialist uprising. He said it was a nationalist uprising against British rule with all the prejudices which existed in Ireland at the time, but no matter, you had to support it because it was a blow against the First World War, it was a blow against British imperialism, and the job of every socialist was to support that movement. Later on, Trotsky said any British socialist who didn't support the Irish struggle for freedom should be branded with bullets, which is perhaps taking it a bit too far. But it's essentially correct in that analysis, and there was a huge argument about that. But Lenin started from the idea you have to support movements in these for national liberation, despite their politics, because they're fighting oppression. And often they are going to reflect the material conditions on the ground. I mean, you know, Catholicism in Ireland gained ground because the Catholic Church was oppressed by the British state in the 19th century, and the Irish peasantry identified with it as the one institution which seemed to be separate from British colonialism, and therefore any rebellion in Ireland has some form of Catholic element to it in terms of that. And Lenin's strategy for world revolution, spelled out really after the Russian Revolution, was one of a combination of working class revolutions in the advanced capitalist countries, you know, most importantly in Germany, but also, he said, 2 blows. He also added into it the blows of the national liberation movements in the underdeveloped world, striking against imperialism. And the combination of the 2 blows could lead to world revolution. And again, Lenin and the new Soviet Union were prepared to support movements and indeed regimes which were a long way from Marxism. In 1922, when the Turkish state was founded by a man called Kemal Atatürk, who defeated a British-sponsored Greek invasion of Turkey. I can't imagine the Greeks invading Turkey at the moment, but anyway, they did. And it was part, essentially, of the Greeks being used by the Brits to subjugate much of Turkey. That Lenin supported Ataturk, and indeed the young Soviet state armed the Turks with it, despite the fact he was anti-communist, and we killed communists actually under the regime. But quite correctly, he understood that actually you had to support the Turkish independent movement against British imperialism's effort to dominate the Dardanelles in that whole region. But that also meant you did not have any illusions about, because you offered support when Ataturk fought British imperialism, about him being much good. So therefore you had to build in Turkey, the job of Turkish communists was to build a separate Turkish Communist Party in opposition to Ataturk on the ground, and we should support that as well. So, two tasks. Yes, we defended Ataturk, if you like, or defended his right to resist British imperialism, but we did not side with Ataturk in that sense, and inside Turkey we wanted to build a movement which would challenge Ataturk down the years. And then, in the course of the years immediately after the Russian Revolution, we began to see the emergence, because of industrialization as a result of the First World War, of quite powerful working classes in a number of countries. In India, for instance, which went through quite a big industrial takeoff as a consequence of the First World War. That's when the Indian cotton industry really took over from the British cotton industry. In Mexico and in China, you see large working classes, not numerically large in terms of the whole population, say, of China or India, but concentrated in particular towns and cities, particularly, say, in China on the eastern seaboard. Right? So, with quite a lot of strength, and again, Trotsky points out that when capitalism comes to somewhere, it does not start off by building itself in the way that British capitalism does. It doesn't start off with enclosures, the Irish potato famine, the Highland clearances, slavery, and sort of the gradual build-up, etc., etc. It comes by bringing in the most modern forms of capitalist industry and development straight into society, which should almost be at a tribal level. But suddenly, overnight, factories will spring up, and a working class will be formed, which is concentrated in big power. And it was Leon Trotsky, in the years after Lenin's death, who argued that actually the conditions in countries like China, Mexico, and India corresponded very much to the conditions which had existed in Russia in 1917. When numerically the Russian working class was small, but was concentrated in huge workplaces actually, had enormous economic strength, and above all had been able to create a hegemony over other sections of the Russian population. And I use that word advisor, which was a phrase used at the time by Lenin and other Bolsheviks again to talk about this. They talked about the need for the Russian working class to have hegemony over the peasantry, over sections of the intelligentsia, and etc., to create an alliance, a historic bloc, which could carry the way forward. A bloc in which the working class had to lead. Right, it had to lead other classes in ways similar to which the bourgeoisie leads other classes in the society we live in. They had to create that dominance. And Trotsky argued that actually that is what communists could do in countries like China or India. That it wasn't just simply a question of supporting national liberation movements, that was absolutely key, I'll come back to it in a second, but also you had to start taking seriously the possibility of building communist parties, working class organisation, and from that he actually argued if you did that, it was possible that the national liberation movement could go from just simply being about national liberation to creating a movement which could sweep beyond that to get economic and social liberation, in other words, socialism. Right? Because the working class, as it had in Russia, could create that kind of alliance and carry that forward. I mean, he was also clear that, for instance, in China, it was necessary to support what was a fairly corrupt and horrible nationalist movement called Kuomintang, eventually defeated by Mao Zedong in 1949, when, for instance, it resisted the Japanese invasion of China in the 1930s. Trotsky argued that the Japanese conquest of China would be a huge victory for world imperialism. It would mean Japanese imperialism would be hugely strengthened by it, and therefore China, which had ceased to be effectively a nation state, I haven't got time to go into this, but it had been parcelled up. Right? There was actually a national issue in China, And therefore it was a job of socialists and working class people in the West to support Chinese nationalists against Japan. Even though Chiang Kai-shek was corrupt, he was anti-communist, he didn't fight, he just simply took the money from the Americans, for instance, and spent it or invested it in Wall Street. You still had to support him, but at the same time had given him no coloration, don't paint him red. Understand that while you defend, if you like, you support the Kuomintang against Japanese imperialism, that is it. And you're critical of everything else about them, and you seek to build a communist party in Japan, to build an independent working class in terms of that. Now, for much of the 20th century, what we saw was a pattern repeatedly of nationalist leaders who would fight imperialism, would often be jailed by imperialism, tortured by imperialism, gain power through armed struggle, make a deal with the old imperialism, and then turn on their followers who rejected that deal and ended up hanging them. For instance, Eamon de Valera, who became Prime Minister and President of the new Irish Republic, actually hanged more IRA members than the Unionist regime in the north of Ireland did. Right? I mean, he was vicious in terms of the way he treated the IRA when he broke them in terms of that. I mean, look at Robert Mugabe again today. We shouldn't forget, it's difficult to remember, Robert Mugabe was a courageous figure. Fought a long guerrilla war. He was in jail under the white settler regime. You know, it was a courageous thing. It was a huge war in what became Zimbabwe against British imperialism. It's hard to remember now, given his track record over the. But that's been the pattern repeatedly in terms of that. And that makes it all the more important to be not going to this unthinking, but to be aware that, of course, we should have supported Mugabe against Ian Smith and the racists. But at the same time, not to be uncritical of him and not to just simply say Robert Mugabe is wonderful. Now I say that because actually for most of the last second half of the 20th century, unfortunately, that is what most of the left did. You know, for instance, in Egypt, clearly you would have supported Abdel Gamal Nasser against French imperialism in 1956 when he attacked SOAS. Just no question about it. I mean, you know, if we'd been around today, it's the equivalent of Stop the War movement, and actually there were mass demonstrations in this city over the question of SOAS. Absolutely take it for granted. And Nasser was, you know, in many ways a more attractive figure than, say, someone like Mugabe in lots of ways. But he walked up communist. He suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood. The official line from Moscow was that communist parties should uncritically support Abdel Gamal Nasser, even though they were in prison, right, because he was a friend of the Soviet Union. And you had the bizarre situation, I think it's correct, John Gibbs says, but the Communist Party was still part of the Mubarak Party, which is the inheritor of Nasser's party, right up to when the man fell last year. Because of that uncritical support for Nasser, which sort of continued on and on through Sadat and Nasser. So effectively, in lots of what was called the Third World at the time, the left ceased to play an independent role in any meaningful terms in countries like Egypt, which have some severe consequences in terms of that. And what I mean by that is when the next, you know, and I think there's also some other differences I just want to talk about. The last great upsurge of working class struggle in the 1970s was in many ways inspired and accompanied by dramatic struggles of national liberation movements, many of which had very distinctly left coloration. You know, my first politicisation was, well, actually it was mainly around the issue of Ireland, and at the time the provisional IRA weren't fantastic left in coloration. They would become so later on. But the other huge issue which is inspiring was the struggle in Vietnam. And anyone who was young in the early 70s could not have helped to be inspired by the Vietnamese liberation struggle, which took place under the leadership of a formerly Marxist Leninist organisation, the Communist Party. You know, was appreciative of the Western solidarity. It was not a stupid movement. All the rest of it was also, you know, quite cynical in many ways about both Beijing and Moscow, who dropped them in it repeatedly in terms of it. They were, in many ways, quite an attractive organisation. I spent a long chunk of his day writing about Yasser Arafat. Now, for those who remember Yasser Arafat at the end of his life, he was a pathetic figure. It's hard to remember that in 1968, Fatah actually stood up and fought the Israelis and defeated them at Karema, which a year after the humiliation of the 68 war was an inspiration for the Palestinians really around the world, and an inspiration for people on the left. It's hard, the impact of something like the ANC or the Front Libération Nationale in Algeria, which was slightly earlier, and even organisations like ETA in Spain. I can remember ETA in 1974 jumping for joy, when they blew up Franco's designated successor. Not just blew him up, but blew the car in which he's travelling completely over a block of flats. So successful was it? I mean, ETA were heroes in the Spanish left at the time, and international. I mean, these were organisations which were attractive and all the rest of it. But of course, look at it now, they more or less did the same thing eventually, a bit longer in most cases. But it took place under different circumstances. It took place in part because of the failure of the left throughout much of the period after the Second World War, and also because in the course of the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the model they had looked to for economic and social development failed. And of course, China, the other alternative, veered off in a different direction as well. And possibly, along with a whole series of other people, like the people who led the Labour Party in Britain, the leadership of the national liberation movements essentially bought into the idea that working class struggle was dead, Marxism was finished, capitalism was here to stay, this was the end of history, the great contest was over, this proved there was no alternative, etc., etc. And what you had was a series of sit-down compromises worked out between leaders of those national liberation movements and their opponents with America or Britain sort of convening the people around the table, where essentially the result depended on how the success of your movement. So the ANC got the best deal of the lot, because it was clear to anyone in international capitalism, even to the leadership of the South African apartheid regime, that the ANC were the only people who could rule South Africa, and anything else just wasn't going to work. Eventually, the Republican movement in Ireland got a good deal, but a grubby deal, but not bad if you just simply measure it in terms of access to office and ministerial cars and nice suits and things like that. They got a good deal. Yasser Arafat, well, he ended up the last 2 years of his life, he was under siege in his compound in Ramallah, at the capital of the Palestinian state. I mean, it was a fairly crap deal, and actually ETA, which I talked about, is only just inching its way towards the negotiating table with the Spanish state, because it was shunned by. But various deals took place. And all of that, I think, added to that, what I talked about the failure, I've created a vacuum into which other forces have emerged. If you look at Lebanon, Hezbollah took most of the social base of the Lebanese Communist Party, which up until the 1970s had been a very significant organisation, had been challenging for power in the 70s in alliance with the PLO for control of Lebanon. Right? Because of the things I talked about, literally the Lebanese Communist Party collapsed, and the people who moved in were Hezbollah. And if you look actually at a lot of what Hezbollah do, they were very conscious of what they were doing. They were providing welfare, schools, things which the Lebanese state could provide, and which to an extent the left and the working class had provided. Hamas did exactly the same in the Gaza Strip. But of course, we saw other forces, most obvious being various forms of radical Islam moving into that area and taking out the left, because, looking round the picture, there was no one who seemed to be standing up to American imperialism, the Zionists and elsewhere. There was a huge space continuing, and nature abhors a vacuum. And that's one part of that, and I think that's something we live in, where a lot of what I talked about in the beginning comes back into play. The left was thrown into huge confusion about this. How do you respond to 9/11? How do you respond to Al-Qaeda? Obviously, you don't support them, right? But actually, you defend, if you like, the fact that, firstly, it's American imperialism to blame, and you point to American imperialism's role around the world, and you explain why it would be people want to do these things. And then you defend, actually, the fact that people under occupation are going to fight back in Iraq and Afghanistan. But at the time, those arguments, which may seem good today, it was a big argument. Because people are completely confused by the fact that these were Islamic organisations which seemed reactionary in a whole range of questions, and how can we support them? And in France, that was one reason among many which has led to, I think, a significant mess on the French left about the question of Islamophobia. But it wasn't restricted to that. It was also reflected, I think, in Palestine, where much of the left in Europe still is actually holds to a two-status position even now. Because they kind of half accept, they've tailed behind Fatah and will not support Hamas for the very reasons. They don't like it. They're put off by it in those terms. And I think I think it's to the credit of the people who helped launch the Stop the War Coalition and others that really in this country we've got essentially the right attitude, which I personally believe stands in that Leninist tradition of opposing imperialism and not siding with it and defending the right to resistance. And that's been one side of the world in the last decade. I think there's two other things I'm just going to try and end on. The other element has been the emergence of powerful new working classes around the world in what I call developing countries. From Brazil to South Korea to Nigeria to South Africa, Indonesia and elsewhere. And if you follow, just searches and things that take place, you can see, huge protests, for instance, by Cosatu at the moment, over the question of road tolls, things like that. Question over the price of fuel tax on fuel in Indonesia, led by trade union movements. Playing quite a decisive role. I was hearing today, again, of workers in Egypt blocking one of the main roads and protests. We can see working classes emerging all the time, often in alliance with other groups in society, interestingly. But I think it's important to say, if you've got a very strong working class emerging, but because of the collapse of the left, if you're underdeveloped politically in lots of ways. Really quite far back in the field compared to what might have been the case, 30, 40 years ago. And of course, that's not going to stay the same. And in a way, I think that the politics of Trotsky's permanent revolution, which is what I talked about, the idea that working class can lead in society, can lead a block of different forms, peasantry, landless labourers, young intellectuals, is a policy which comes into play at the moment. And before I go to my final point, I think that's an obvious question in the case of Egypt. I think there's a sort of mechanical reading of that, which says that what happens in Egypt is after Mubarak falls, that's the sort of democratic bit of the Egyptian revolution over, and therefore we just move on to talking about social issues, strikes, and the working class. Well, that misses out a huge chunk. Firstly, it's obvious the democratic bit is not over, but secondly as well, the job of socialists, of course, is, yes, strikes, working class organisation, etc., etc., but it's actually to take up democratic issues and develop them in the most radical way. We have a lot to say about this. We have a different vision of democracy. And in Egypt, the job of the left is surely to create exactly a united front or a bloc between it and other sections of Egyptian society. Some of the young middle-class anti-capitalist radicals thrown up by the protests who want that. The landless, the Felahin, different sections of the population. That's their job, to combine democratic demands with socialist demands and bring the two of them together in a way that talks about what our vision of democracy, real democracy is in terms of it. The final feature of the last 3 decades has been the return of war to centre stage in imperialism. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, or take it for granted, but I just want to take you back to something which was marked, I think, last month, which was Britain's decision to go to war over what seemed at that time a very strange and obscure issue, the Argentinian occupation of the Falklands. And a lot of humming and hawing in the White House as to who they should support, whether they should support the Brits or the Argentinians. And they eventually supported the Brits. And it's quite interesting. I dug out a quote from the then Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan, who looked at the Falklands and talked about its significance at the time. And this is an interesting quote, because what you've got to remember, in 1982, the Americans had been in a position after their defeat in Vietnam where they could not intervene anywhere in the world. Right, they had to watch the Shah of Iran fall and be humiliated with the hostage crisis. Right, in terms of it. They hadn't been able to deal with Portugal. The whole series of things that happened were because of a huge anti-war movement. George Shultz wrote this. He says, the British decision to go to war was the first marker laid down by a democratic power in the post-Vietnam era to state unambiguously that a free world nation was willing to fight for a principle. The world paid attention to this. It was noted by the Soviets too. In other words, what Thatcher was doing in a way was something which Reagan carried on with, was rolling back the effect of Vietnam, making it acceptable that imperialist powers could go all the way around the world to fight a war. And America would do that. If you look as to where it got today, it started with an obscure island called Grenada in the West Indies, which America invaded in, I think, 1983 to overthrow a left-wing government. And Grenada wasn't important to anyone, but it was the American imperialism saying, basically, we're back. And it began with a series of building up points to the big one, which is Iraq. And then since then it's not ended. And I think it's important to say that is what imperialism in many ways, the crudest, is about. And it's important to say that is what imperialism is about.
Okay. Okay, so we've come in with plenty of time. left for discussion. So if people want to indicate if they want to speak or just ask a question, people should feel free just to ask a question, and either Chris will answer it or somebody else will answer it. But I don't feel you have to make a contribution. I'm going to try and keep contributions or anything you want to say to 3 minutes to start with.
Just starting on some of the war as part of imperialism and the legitimacy of countries fighting back against that. I think that's a really important point. But in the most recent wars, you've seen actions by the Americans which have increased the ability of the resistance to fight back. A polarised war, a longer war, and those who are making the decisions to go to war and in power just happen to own the companies which profit from going to war. So in the case of Iraq, they went against the Pentagon's advice to not sack the Iraqi army. They left 26 weapons dumps intact, lost 14 billion in cash, and then let it simmer for 6 months and sort of harass the population a bit, and had some friendly fire events and things like that. The other thing, and that led to a longer, greater war. And then the other thing with imperialism is the population back home, or the anti-war movement, or working class organisation. Seeing a pattern of, certainly in the Afghanistan war, we're seeing far cheaper drugs arriving on our shores more readily and more easily, which would prevent working class communities fighting back against that imperialism. And particularly in South America, when they were doing ops down there that weren't known to the USA public, there's a growing body of evidence that they were shipping guns out there and flying cocaine back, and just so that it didn't turn up on the books. So it has an impact, very direct impact back home and how they're doing it. So I just wanted to contribute that. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. I have a question about, so you have national liberation movements or kind of resistance struggles in different countries. Some come up with the conclusion later on that Marxism is dead and there's no alternative and all that. And others, like in the case of Nepal, say, oh no, we're still on the revolutionary path. We haven't abandoned the revolution, all that. But they've come into the mainstream. And how do you kind of, and they're just as bourgeois and neoliberal as the other parties and whatever. How do you sort of know, really, I guess? It's a bit of a strange question. I mean, how do you kind of respond to that? How do you know that they have or haven't abandoned the revolutionary path? Is it just a question of looking at a specific case in every country, concrete analysis of concrete situation, or is there something about these movements? I know it's not inevitable, of course, but what is it about, those that we can kind of say, yes, this is definitely, been abandoned?
Well, just to answer that, it is a question of really, it's a profound question of Marxism, actually, knowing that things don't stay the same as what they are. And if you study particularly Trotsky's writings on China, on the Kuomintang, he points out that they do go through a change. And it's generally when they started, at the end of a successful movement against the imperialists, they then started moving against the communists. And there were two very awful massacres of communists, Canton and Shanghai. So it is that knowing that things do not stay the same, that your analysis cannot just be as it seemed to be yesterday, is I always think Lenin's strong point, because he. But you have, I mean, it was very clear, for example, in South Africa, when the ANC abandoned the Workers' Charter and adopted a bourgeois charter. You know, the I forget the name of the declaration. But anyway, they actually abandoned the Workers' Charter, and as the ANC moved into power, they went into the unions, stripped out all the militants in the unions, and put in people that had come back from exile. You know, in a sense, my comrades watched that happen in South Africa. There wasn't much they could do about it. They got sidelined in that way, you know. And there were, the discussion at the Second Congress of the Communist International on that very question was a very difficult one, because somebody said, these are bourgeois, these are national revolutionaries, and somebody said, well, at the same time, they're bourgeois nationalists. And it depends which bit comes out on top, you know, which you have to watch. The question I wanted to ask was that you say correctly that the Socialist International, the resolutions at the congresses were mainly not anti-imperialist. But the discussion in Lenin's book, and I very, very strongly recommend that people read Imperialism by Lenin, because it's a very, very rich book with lots of nuances in it. His argument is against the Marxists in the Second International, who had helped him to, and Trotsky had helped him to understand imperialism. By the way, it's a specific stage of capitalism. It's not just capitalism, it's a specific period of capitalism. Starting, I mean, colonialism has a long history in capitalism. It's tied up completely with the formation of capitalism, but imperialism is a specific stage. And Lenin's argument with his mentors, Kautsky and Hilferding, was that they were trying to reform imperialism, and they thought you could turn the clock back and have capitalism with many, many competing capitals and without the features of imperialism. Lenin's point was, no, this period is here to stay, and it is the prelude to world revolution. It has created the conditions for socialism. So although many of the superficial features of imperialism have, I think, changed, I think he was right on that one.
Thank you.
In some ways, I just wanted to ask that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Gulf states seem to be little colonies of the United States, in a sense. So they're strategically placed for the purpose of being used and using Islam, you know, the ideology of Islam and the beacon of Islam, Saudi Arabia. And we've seen recently how factions within Bahrain have kind of challenged that. And through the media, people have actually seen how the states how the United States use the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, as a pawn, but it kind of backfires on them because they talk about democracy, but actually what they're doing is they're allowing slavery still to continue within the Middle East. So my question is, at what point will we see a clash of civilizations, in a sense, the tipping point at which a critical mass begin to fight against what is seen as democracy or freedom, but actually is just colonialism, but dressed up in sheep's clothing, basically.
Do you want to get back and answer any of those? So I'll ask the questions.
The question of the Gulf states is that in Bahrain was a British, has been about a British colony since 1820, very early on. and they created the Counterfire regime. They basically picked out a pirate family and said, okay, we'll have you to stop piracy. That was the first priority. Right? They put them in power. They then had a Sunni minority ruling house, which was very oppressive, which, for instance, only Shia paid taxes, right, until quite recently, the Shia and the majority of the population. We shouldn't fall for this, by the way. There are Sunni, a Sunni MP whose house was shot up last week by forces, and they've been pardoned. Bahrain has a long history of resistance. It's a fascinating history, actually, against British imperialism and the Al-Khilafahs. One of the most advanced histories of resistance of any of the countries on that peninsula, which is continuing. But it also has one difference from the other Gulf states. In the Gulf states today, 70% of the working class are foreign workers who are there with no rights and are regularly deported, as we know. Therefore, essentially, an economic model has come, which in Dubai and elsewhere, eventually has not neutralised the working class, but makes it very difficult for that working class to function. In Bahrain, the majority of the working class, it's 57%, are indigenous. Right, so there's quite a big difference between Bahrain and elsewhere, and therefore I think you're seeing a move which is coming, which is why this thing has been more sustained. I'm very interested in Bahrain, so you have to tell them to stop me at the moment. But I think it's fascinating, and it's disgusting the lack of coverage, and the fact that the Khilafah is coming here in 2 weeks' time for state dinner with the Queen. It was unbelievable, actually, after the Grand Prix incident. The people who want, and I don't think it's necessarily a clash of civilizations, the people who want, if you like, a version of clash of civilizations in the region at the moment, in my opinion, the Saudis. The Saudis want to bring on, and would love to see anyone, including the Israelis, attack Iran because they fear Iranian hegemony in the region. But the other thing they want in Syria and elsewhere is to essentially stir up a Sunni versus Shia conflict. And that is what they are doing, and they're doing it as well elsewhere. They're sponsoring the Salafists in Egypt and in Tunisia. They're playing a very dangerous role at the moment, and with Britain and America tagging along behind it in a way, I think quite worried in a sense as well about what's going on, but not in a position to control it. So it's an interesting position, but I think it's important to say that that the movement in Bahrain has not fallen for that. The movement in Jordan hasn't fallen for it either, which is quite interesting. The Arab Spring is continuing in at least 2 countries. In it. But we see elsewhere, obviously, the whole question of Syria closed that. On Bob's one, I think it's right. I think the strength of Lenin was he was attacking, as I said, that mechanical view, essentially, which I think is the imperialism would lead to the economic development, which would then mean you could have socialism further down the road. And it required a big argument. And the arguments went on. If you read the discussions at the Second Congress of the Communist International, there is a big chunk where the Russians suddenly take on the American delegates about the black question in the United States. And suddenly you have Lenin and others standing up and saying, should you support the right of the blacks in the southern states to have their own state? Now, in a way, it's a bit of a bargaining position. But the health of it was the fact that the dominant position on the American left was essentially to ignore the whole racial division. And the industrial workers of the world, the best section who were there, the best section of the American left essentially took an attitude that simply people went and strike together, you'd overcome those racial divisions. What Lenin was doing and others were doing was just sort of taking the stick and bending it right over and saying, actually, in the United States of America, the key divide, which is holding back the working class, and in a sense this is a national liberation question in a way, and it is the divide between black and white. You have to bend the stick so every American socialist supports the black movement. And again, arguments of rage. You had the argument before, but the key figure in the black movement is Marcus Garvey, who's got reactionary politics, etc. It doesn't matter. Garvey, what they were saying is Garvey gives people pride. That's a good thing. And it's a fascinating discussion, and you see where Lenin's politics come from in this. He's looking at it in a very practical way in terms of, just on the question, how do you judge national liberation movements? I think quite simply by their deeds and not their actions. All national liberation movements have 2 faces. Essentially what they want is a nation state and national unity. That's a good thing when you're fighting against imperialism. This is a bad thing when you get your nation state and people go and strike and demonstrate or do things you don't approve of, right? Or continue to attack the border you've just carved out with Britain along the 6 counties of Ulster. Then you turn on them. And I think you have to judge it like that. And I'll go back to the example of Kemal Atatürk. Kemal Atatürk was a swine in lots of ways, what he did in terms of Turkey. But you judge one of his deeds, and I'll tell you why I'm looking at Atatürk about British imperialism. The Tory backbench body is called the 1922 Committee. Because in 1922, the Tories rebelled against the Lloyd George coalition. Lloyd George was then a Liberal, so it's a Lib Dem coalition, rebelled against it because Lloyd George had been the architect of the British intervention into Turkey. And when that was defeated, the Tories rebelled and voted him out. So if you like, the fact the 1922 committee is there is a tribute to a blow struck by Kemal Ataturk against British imperialism. And in that sense, he did a good thing.
Okay, we've still got more time for contributions, so we're going to have a few more questions and a few more contributions.
Coming back on taking up sort of Sarah's point about democracy, really, I suppose. I mean, it strikes me that there are two kind of imperialism sort of developments. There's been an attempt to kind of mask it by the sort of ruling powers with two key words. One of them is democracy, and the other one is globalization. And it strikes me that another reason, if you like, to that people say in Egypt should be taking up this argument about democracy is that if you don't do that, it means that phrase does get increasingly co-opted by a ruling class who are trying to exploit it and justify wars in its name. So if democracy becomes associated with bombs, that's because that association is being made deliberately by a class that is trying to get some kind of veneer of legitimacy for their actions. So actually, when taking up an argument in society about what democracy actually is and what it actually looks like, comes to one of strategy of how do you actually get to democracy? Do you get it from subjugating people, from blowing them up and then hoping that the green shoots of recovery will do the rest? Or do you do it from actually creating democratic structures in society? And when you start talking about democracy as actually creating something that's democratic and inclusive in society, that leads straight into arguments about what socialism is. It is the extension of democratic ideas from just voting every 4 years into every area of life, into the workplaces where you live. So actually, a very vigorous way of arguing for socialism is actually to do it in a way that people can relate to, which is talking about democracy, the immediate struggles for democracy that people face now, even for a simple form of national democracy, and then taking it forward and saying, yes, that's democracy, but there's also other forms of democracy as well, and then extending the argument like that, as opposed to crudely saying, yes, we need socialism, without actually explaining that this is about democracy. Socialism is the ultimate fight for democracy. It's taking it to its kind of logical conclusion.
Yeah, I just want to draw out some of the kind of the kind of consequences of the transition in modern imperialism between colonial rule and independent nation states, which are still subordinate in the imperialist structure, because there is quite an important distinction between those two cases. When you have a movement against direct colonial rule, like the Indian movement against British colonialism, or the NASA movement against the British and the French, and so on and so forth, there's a difference between that, which is trying to expel the direct administration of that country by the colonial powers, and what exists afterwards. When there is an independent nation state, and there is an indigenous ruling class in control of that state, they may still be subordinate in the power structure of imperialism. They may still be subject to imperial domination in a variety of different ways, but it changes the relationship between the movement and the local population. At the time when the whole of the movement is ranged against the colonial power and trying to kick it out, all classes, or nearly all classes, except those that are most directly subordinated and bought by the imperial powers, are ranged against the power structure. Once you have your own nation state, then there's an indigenous ruling class which is running that state machine in opposition to the vast majority of the population who are still doing the work, still being exploited, in most cases still denied any democratic participation in the society at all. And that moves you from a situation when you look at imperialism and the way in which it's appropriate to respond to the power structure of imperialism, it moves you a little bit away from Lenin's position that he had over the question of the Irish, where he says, look, no matter what the problems with the Irish movement, the entire Irish movement, with all the rubbish in it, is fighting the British, and that's the most important, and that's the most important thing. But if you started applying that model, say in Libya recently, or in Syria, where you have post-colonial states which are run by an indigenous Syrian and Libyan ruling class, you get into trouble because you start making excuses for the Assad regime or excuses for the Gaddafi regime. And you only have to look, I mean, the Gaddafi regime is a particularly brilliant example because you only have to look at its history to see that it isn't a continuous and systematic history of opposition to imperialism. There was a period of opposition to imperialism after the colonial battle is won. Reagan is bombing them in 1983 for precisely that reason. Then there's a period where Gaddafi decides to come in from the cold. There's the meeting with Tony Blair in the desert. There's the opening of the Libyan economy to the Western powers. And then, which should be a kind of lesson for nearly all third world dictators, of course, this doesn't do you any good if the imperial powers decide to change their mind and you get blatted around again. But the one thing you shouldn't do in these circumstances is say Colonel Gaddafi is a heroic anti-imperialist and we should all support him. No, the people you support there are the Syrian people or the Libyan people who have the right to self-determination, who have the right not to be subordinated to imperialism, who have the right not to have the Western powers interfere in their country. But the states that have dominated them since the colonial period are sometimes states which find themselves in opposition to imperialism, not because they're anti-imperialist, but because the imperialists are against them, which is a different condition. It's a different state, it's a different condition altogether, and they don't have the same relation to the domestic population as they would have if they were at the head of a national liberation movement. It's no good saying that today the ANC has the same relationship to the black working class in South Africa as it had when it was fighting against apartheid. It doesn't. It's privatised half the industries. It's overseeing the imposition of neoliberal economic policies. That's a different relationship, and I think that quite a lot of the left gets confused because it hasn't marked what the transition from direct colonial rule and anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism meant in that era, and what it means in an era where there are independent nation states who are still subordinate to the imperial power structure, but have a different relationship to their domestic population and to the imperial powers than they would have been if they were just part of an anti-colonial movement.
Thank you, John. Do we have any more? Is there any questions? I mean, we've had a whole lot of controversies on the left in the last 6 months. There's over Libya. A bit of a controversial issue. Does anybody want to say anything about these or raise any questions?
I think just contribute one thing, just how easily imperialism could be unravelled in that there's a serious movement at the moment for Scotland for their independence, and that would certainly limit the supply of soldiers to the British Army. But then the other thing as well is that all of these states that get invaded at one point mooted the idea of trading oil in euros, which is key to the US's ability to finance its own huge debt. And in that, 2/3 of US dollars are used for the trade in oil, and if you all of a sudden start trading oil in euros and the demand for US dollars drops, that would halve the value of their currency. And it's already, the US dollar's dropped sufficiently enough, or halved itself. It would take another blow if they started doing that. So it was Libya, Iraq and Iran, the only countries that I'm aware of that have mooted trading oil in euros, and really that's probably something that we could all perhaps support, is that we do find an alternate currency to trade oil, because that's not such a big deal. You think, well, you can trade it in whatever you want, that's the market, supply and demand, and if it has the effect of limiting the reach of the United States to commit acts of war against other countries, and it's not just been more recent wars, it's been 70 democracies since World War II. There's and you know, several million deaths as well, and that's something that, you know, could we bring it to an end with a simple thing of supporting the trading of oil in euros? And certainly they seem to be very scared of that.
I think I'm going to let, what was the second bite, but Chris hasn't spoken, so I'll take Chris and then Bob.
Yeah, I mean, if no one else is going to raise Syria, then I will. I mean, third worldism was always a kind of a wrong position, because it was what it was the idea that, you know, the left in the West should basically say we completely support Castro and the post-revolutionary regime in Cuba, we think it's brilliant, etc., was always one-sided. It was right to support the Cuban uprising against US imperialism. It was wrong to suggest that Cuba was socialist, because it clearly wasn't. It was an unequal society that was run by a kind of nationalist, a national ruling class. With all there were lots of improvements, but that wasn't real 100% liberation. But now, in the current situation, to sort of pursue a third worldist approach to the situation is so much wronger than it was then, because now what you're doing is to say, I mean, some people on the left uncritically support Assad, you know, support the Assad regime, which, I mean, you know, I think that's completely indefensible for the reasons John said, that, you know, Assad never led a movement against imperialism. He leads a country which is clearly a class-ridden, very, very authoritarian country, which at times has got into some sort of arguments or some sort of opposition to the dominant imperialisms, but obviously is pursuing its own interests in the West. So, I mean, a simple position of saying, you know, we back Gaddafi or we back Assad seems to me to be completely wrong. There is, however, another equally wrong position that people on the left are taking, which is that we uncritically back the Syrian opposition. We think that whatever the Syrian opposition do is right because they're fighting against a dictator. Now, the problem with that position is that it's not locating their role in the sort of wider picture of imperialism as well, because unfortunately what's happened is that to some extent, although the opposition is complex and there's lots of different strands within it, the leadership of the Syrian opposition has basically made its peace with the West. And so if you just uncritically support the Syrian opposition, what you're doing is you're saying you're allowing imperialism to come back in through the back door, and actually you're kind of agreeing with the West position. So in those circumstances, I think the position that, you know, we should and do take is that we are against all Western intervention in the Middle East. We completely, and in principle, take, and in practice, take the position that there's nothing the West can do in the Middle East that would be good, because they are the source of a good deal of the problems in that region and many others. And that's our main point, because we're in Britain and we're in the West, and that's the main thing that we do. If we were in Syria, what we'd be arguing for would be to get rid of Assad, but to understand that any movement that successfully gets rid of Assad, that can successfully get rid of Assad and introduce real democracy and real progress, has to be against the West as well. And I think that's the slightly nuanced position, the slightly new position that anti-imperialists have to take in this slightly new situation.
Okay, I'll take rid of that.
Yeah, just agree with Rees there. As we saw in Libya, the West was trying to hijack the revolution. It was very uneasy to see in Libya people, Libyans saying that they love NATO and they love the US and UK. It was very uncomfortable to hear that. Understandable, because, you know, they're gay arms and somehow they see them as liberators. But I think Syria is much more important, because I think that the West and Israel want to break that relationship between Syria and Hezbollah, want to break that relationship between Syria and Iran. Now, this doesn't automatically mean that we support the regime, because we don't. But at the same time, the opposition, when you talk about the opposition, who is the opposition? You've got the Syrian National Council, a bunch of guys in suits who are having meetings in Tunisia now, and you know, are closer to the West than the people on the ground. You've got the Free Syrian Army. You're still, in terms of comparison to the Syrian forces, about 300,000 Syrian army, and you've only had a handful in comparison defect. But also what we can't underestimate is the Qataris, the Gulf states, who are essentially the agents of the West, who are they're ready to fund the rebels, to supply them with weapons. And essentially I think the opposition, or the people on the ground, are between a rock and a hard place. On one side they've got the regime, on the other side they've got the Qataris who are saying, hold on, we'll give you money, we'll give you weapons, and increasingly kind of this, I don't know if people know the increase, especially in Libya and Syria now as well, with the Wahhabi Salafi strand of scholars pushing this kind of sectarian agenda. Like they've got Saudi TV in Syria and constantly paying this scholar out called Al-Arouj, who's extremely sectarian. So we've got these problems emerging, and I think that the best for us is to be principled and to say these are our principles, regardless of what country it is. These are set principles that we say no to Western intervention, but at the same time we do not blindly support any opposition group that claims to represent the people, because obviously the Syrian National Council, even in Libya now, they clearly don't.
Capitalism of the 19th century. And that explains the solidarity between the working class in the advanced nations, quote, using your classification, quite right, and the masses in the subaltern, shall we say, nations. So while I understand that something like the anti-war movement in Britain was built on that you don't invade another nation, and it kept it very simple, very straight, and the bit of the big demonstration I stewarded proudly told me that 12 coaches had come from Bradford on Avon. All right, colonels' wives, every layer. While I appreciate that that movement was built that way and it was enormously important and powerful, nevertheless we have to understand that the main attack is against finance. It's against capital, and it's playing that divide that's very, very difficult and requires a lot of skill. Sorry, stop.
Okay, last chance before I bring Chris back. Any questions? Burning questions you wanted to answer? Okay, Chris.
Okay, I want to come back on imperialism because, of course, we concentrate in the discussion on imperialism in terms of colonialism, national race struggles, etc. But I think it's important to say that in terms of imperialism, when you look at it, actually the most important relationship in imperialism is not the relationship between the imperialist countries and what you might call the global south. It is between the imperialist states. And that was true in 1914, when Britain's biggest trading partners were the United States, Germany, etc. accentuated the rivalry. And I say that because if you look at, for instance, the City of London, of its revenues in 2008, at the height of the boom, out of 40 billion that came in, 27 billion, so all but 13 billion, came from the EU, the US and Canada next, and Japan, Switzerland and Australia. So, despite the hype about the BRICS and all the rest of it, this is the world's dominant casino here. You know, its revenue and its money operations are still very much situated inside what the imperialist countries. And I said, I brought it on to, I said, just to talk about British imperialism, I think it's important to say that, you know, to say because of, in many ways, its assets inherited, British imperialism is still a very tangible thing. You know, if you look at, of the world's top 100 non-financial corporations, right, so this is not finance capital, the top 100, the number one, the biggest share comes the Americans who've got 18 of those 100 corporations. Next is Britain and France with 15. Then comes 13 Germany, and then 9 Japanese. Britain has got, you know, number 2 in the world is Royal Dutch Shell. Then Vodafone, then BP, then Strata, then Rio Tinto, Zinc, Anglo-American. I can keep going through. You know, most of these are, in some ways, are British nominally in the sense they're headquartered here, but they're multinationals and they are tied to the British state, believe you me. very much tied to the British state in terms of that. And in terms of finance capital, and you're correct in this, which Britain ties with America in having the 7 of the top 50 financial and banking institutions in the world. So Britain, you're still talking about a significant clout here in terms of that. And partly explain the relationship in Britain and America. There's another factor to come into that. But Britain is still the biggest investor in the United States by a long way. It invests in double this number, which is number 2, which is Japan. Right? So these are very important inter-imperialist things, which lead to strains and tensions all the time, as well as alliances in terms of that. Just on Paul's point about Europe, I think there's a slight danger with this, which I'm going to say, is that I can imagine the people who sort of 10 years ago would say, well, why don't we sort of ditch the dollar and go into the euro, because the European model was that Mars and Venus, wasn't it? The Europeans are more cuddly, the Americans are aggressive, they're Mars, the Europeans are Venus, we go with with the collapse of the Eurozone, who's the new contender? Well, it's going to be the Chinese. And the Chinese are an imperialist power. They're an imperialist power in relation to Tibet and their own Muslim areas, but also what they're doing in Africa and Latin America as well. They're further in their interest. We should not, and it can lead, and I've seen this already by some people on the left who still believe that somehow, or believe that in some fanciful way, China is progressive, it's some sort of left-wing alternative and all the rest of it, and end up like the people you're talking about, thinking Gaddafi and Assad is great, thinking the Chinese are the 7th cavalry, are going to come and save us. Well, they're not. So I think we should ditch that. Just in terms of Syria, just a couple of things that I will say on it. The West is really good at co-opting people. When it wants to co-opt people, it co-opts them. Up until 1990, we were supported, up until 1998, we supported Kosovo independence in former Yugoslavia. Overnight, we stopped supporting it when somebody went in and said, this is the way basically to get Serbia. Now, that didn't involve me, we ended up supporting Serbia for the reasons John said, but overnight it changed. You look at the Kurds. The Kurds historically are a movement we've always supported. They've got a horrible record of tying with different powers in the region, and currently they are clearly involved in a horrible operation with the Americans in the north of Iraq, which is actually quite a disgusting operation in lots of ways. And therefore, we oppose actually the Kurdish entity in the north, what it's doing. You have to look at these things in concrete terms. The Assad regime, what has it ever done against imperialism? It's never done anything to the Israelis, apart from an attack by them. Right? It crushed the left and the Palestinians in Lebanon when they were about to win the civil war in the 1970s. It's occupied Lebanon with a disgusting role inside Lebanon in terms of that. It has no history, apart from rhetoric, about anti-imperialism. And I think what people are saying is right. I think the same rule of thumb should apply to Iran. And of course, with Iran, we should start with the Western hypocrisy of them lecturing someone who wants to develop a nuclear power program. When after all the British were desperate for Iran to develop a nuclear power program in the 1970s under the Shah. No problem then, right? So we should point to the hypocrisy all the time, and of course we should oppose any Western intervention against Iran. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that somehow Khamenei, Ahmadinejad is not really in control of things, are somehow progressives. Or we side with them, in a sense. They have a horrendous role in terms of the internal regime. Not the worst actually in the world in terms of, but so I should explain that. In a sliding scale of 10, actually, they're probably not the worst dictatorship in the world, but not much a choice you want to get into, is it? On Britain, and I want to come back to it, just to end on. Why does all this matter? Well, there's a few things, forgive me because I've just been writing about it. And I'll go back again to the Falklands, because again, an interesting quote from Newsweek on the 30th anniversary of the Falklands. There's looking back, the Falklands War was a precedent-setting local war. It became the first of a series of military interventions directed at non-communist countries in which the UK would be involved. The Gulf War, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, we've got that one, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. In retrospect, the Falklands War makes perfect sense, given that the US supporting the UK would be in the forefront of such operations with its EU junior partners falling into line by the United States. In short, the Falklands War was a new type of operation in the part of an old imperialist country to pursue intervention without using the justification of communist threat, but of fighting for freedom and democracy against a third world dictatorship. And boy, isn't that what we've had for the last 3 decades? If you remember, those who are old enough to remember, that's three of us in the room. You know, it began with Galtieri, then with Argentina being the new Hitler. Everyone since has been the new Hitler, haven't they? You know, Saddam Hussein, Milosevic, all the way through. You know, the same rhetoric has been brought out to justify this. Suddenly discovering there's a human rights problem in Libya, as John says, because we've just been sending people to be tortured there. You know, all the rest of it. And it's the justification for this. So, in terms of that, I mean, British imperialism is a cynical thing which has not yet found its way quite in the world. I'll come back to it. And perhaps I'll put it for the word of Tony Blair. I can't find his quote now, but basically he said, I mean, this accepts it. This is Britain since 1956 in SOAS took a choice that having been humiliated by America in SOAS, right, it would just tag along behind America. France went off somewhere else. France decided it was going to build a relationship with Germany and build what became the European Union because it couldn't trust the Anglo-Saxons, right? But since then, and this is Tony Blair, he says, Tony Blair in 2002, this is The Economist, he said, defence ties bring America big benefits, blah, blah, blah. But course ties bring dependence and obligation. In 2002, Mr. Blair accepted that Britain had to pay a, quote, blood price for this special relationship. At moments of crisis, he said, America had to know that Britain was, quote, prepared to be there when the shooting starts. Now, and that is cynical imperialism talking, in crude terms. That is Blair saying this is Britain's relationship, this is Britain's interest, we are going to pay a blood price. Of course, it's not him that's going to pay the blood price, it's us in terms of it. And lastly, because of course being prompted by it, I couldn't resist it. This is just in terms of where Britain's at today. This is Lord West, former First Sea Lord and security advisor to Gordon Brown, on Britain's role in the world, and reacting in the Daily Telegraph to the idea that Britain is now a second-tier power. It says, this business of a second-tier power. We are probably, depending on what figures used, the 5th or 6th wealthiest nation in the world. We have the largest percentage of our GDP on exports, apart from tiny countries around the world, Singapore, places like that. We run world shipping from the UK. We are the largest European investor in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Rim. So our money and our wealth depends on this global scene. We are a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, and I think that gives us a certain clout, a certain ability, don't you? This means we are not a second-tier power. We are not bloody Denmark or Belgium, and if we try to become that, I think we're worse off as a result. Now, that is, and I'll just say that Lord West went to Clydebank High School, and I have a tiny suspicion he does actually worry a little bit that if Scotland got away, Britain, what would remain, would look a little bit like Belgium or Denmark. And these things, prestige matters, if you like, or end in this thought. And I think Thatcher understood that quite well around the Falklands. It's not just that she fought the war to win an election. I think she understood quite well that actually in order to rebuild and rebrand British imperialism, you had to do this. You know? Otherwise you looked like, you know, you were the kid in the block who got bullied by everyone. You know? And therefore prestige matters. And I don't think, in a sense, Scotland breaking away is going to be a massive radical change. I think it opens up possibilities in Scotland, blah, blah, blah. But I'm not entirely sure, and I've used this rhetoric in the past, so forgive me, the people in Calcutta will be dancing in the thought of retribution against British imperialism. I don't have to come into it. But I do think, just in terms of prestige, they look a bit stupid if Scotland went its own way. And I think there's enough in that for me to think, yeah, okay, we should do that. Because actually, they would look stupid. They would look like bloody Denmark or bloody Belgium, wouldn't they? And that is really where Britain should be, but there you go.
I think there'll be some kind of race one, which is going to split first, put more Belgium. So there you go. More Belgium than the government. Oh yeah, Europe's first true anarchy. Okay, so next week there'll be the next meeting in this series, which will be Lindsey German talking on Marxism and oppression. And that'll be at the same time, 6:30, in the same place, which is here. Everybody will be very much welcome, and people will go. As we said at the start of the meeting, if you're going to go to the East London Missile meeting, people stay behind and have a chat. And also to remind people that on Thursday is the PCS, UCU, and night strike over the pensions. So understand there'll be local picket lines. So if anybody's wanting to go down to the local picket line, obviously in Liverpool, college or local, like Dolphins or Drop Centre or something. We've got broadsheets here if you want to take them down. Obviously, strikers are very much always pleased to see people come to support them, especially early in the morning.
Fleet Reserve is on strike as well. Fleet
There you go. Crazy.
Also, there's a Stop the War activist meeting on Thursday at 52 Gower Street.
52 Gower Street.
Yeah.
And that's the one. That's the one. 5 Richmond here. Yeah.
About the NATO protest. Next Saturday, there's a big protest against NATO at the US Embassy. So the activist meeting is about the protest.
Okay.
And actually, there's a